Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning for those of you in the United States or the rest of the world. I'm speaking to you from the Africa Center for the Study of the United States here in Johannesburg, South Africa. My name is Gilbert Kadiagala, the director of the center. I welcome you to this series of events on US elections and the meaning for Africa. It's very interesting this week that we had a tumultuous week with the US presidential debates this week, and then today's news about President and the First Lady testing positive for COVID-19. So this is an occasion then for our two speakers today to reflect on the meaning of this week for US presidential elections. When we set up this forum, the idea was, in fact, to enlighten African audiences on the meaning of US elections, but also on the meaning of US elections for Africa. So we've been having quite a number of excellent discussions. Today's event fits into that mode of what does the US election mean? What does the US election mean in the context of what we saw on Wednesday morning and in the context of what just occurred this morning? We are very privileged to have two distinguished speakers who are going to walk us through the subject matter, which was generally the media approaches, particularly African media's reportage of US elections. From two renowned scholars and journalists, Professor Nixon Karithi, who is with the Tangaza Media. Nixon has been working for the Africa Center for the Study of the US, producing a very important media coverage, media monitoring coverage of Africa, of the US in African media. And so he's been very critical to producing those reports, which are also on our website. And they are very good for research, but also just to get a sense of how is the US reported in Africa. So we'll have Nixon coming on first to talk about the African media and US elections. But as I said also from the outset, he can jump in with his reflections on what this week has meant for the US elections. And then after Nixon speaks, then we'll have Brooks Spector, who we've had on various occasions on this forum with the Daily Maverick, a former US diplomat and now retired in South Africa, and writes every week on the US and US presidential elections. So without taking much time, I think I want to invite Nixon to come in here and give us his perspective. And then after that, we can move on to Brooks Spector. Nixon, please.
Thank you, Gilbert. It's a wonderful afternoon in South Africa. Probably a very somber day, Friday around the world, given the news, early this morning or overnight for some. But I'll leave that to Brooks to deal with. Ours is from Tangaza Africa Media, and myself is to look at what has the African media been saying about the relations between the US and Africa over the past 6 months or so. We thought it would be appropriate to look at the period since Vice President Biden became the de facto candidate for the Democratic Party, to take that period, which is around early April, until now, and then look at what kind of conversations were going on in African media. Now, given that there are huge volumes of coverage of the United States and Africa in African media in any given month, what we've done is that we've developed some kind of broad patterns, and I'll speak to them. And I'm available, obviously, to engage, with anyone on what has been going on, and so I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to engaging with everybody. I apologize. I'm going to just put my presentation the way it should be. Okay, here we go. There we go. So we are looking at the news cycle, September to April to September 2020. And as the topic was given to us, the implications for media, democracy, and society in Africa. And I think part of what you see right across coverage, if we were to look at it by regions, let's start with East Africa. What you see in the coverage in East Africa is that there were a variety of issues that emerged, but there were very unique issues that were being discussed in the media. There isn't another year, probably since 1998 or quite a while, when Sudan has been so much in the news. And if you look at this graph, which takes from 1 April to 30 September, the yellow line represents Sudan, and you will see Sudan got inordinately high coverage. Two issues actually came out in this coverage. The one was that there were hearings in the Supreme Court, and they got a lot of coverage on trials by victims of the US embassy bombings in Nairobi. And the trials were actually against Sudan, whom the US government found culpable as having helped Al Qaeda in those bombings. Now, I mean, that was covered extensively, but intertwined in that coverage was what was going on behind the scenes, diplomatic attempts by Sudan to get closer to Washington. And what has happened is that there were some exchanges and of some engagements that led to to what was being seen in the media as a softening stance by Washington towards Sudan. The key the key point that needed to be dealt with was obviously the compensation of victims of the bombings, and the U.S. courts were already proceeding with that. Sudan is not really contesting that, according to the reports, but there was a lot that was seen in those areas. So that was the one issue where the Sudan featured. The second issue involved Ethiopia, the Green Line, and the Sudan and the United States. And the one other player that's not in this graph is Egypt. So it turns out that between the Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia, they have this dispute that has actually gotten quite serious over the use of the River Nile. And it's always been there that there has been tensions over the River Nile. But what has happened this year is that Ethiopia's plans to build a huge power dam that is going to change energy dynamics in the Horn of Africa and whole of Eastern Africa. They started their plans to construct the dam in earnest. Egypt, which argues that its livelihood is drawn from River Nile, was very much opposed to this dam, and so the conversations ended up into the media, the contest between Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt, and the United States joined in as the arbitrator or mediator, and and those talks failed because essentially the line that the U.S. had proposed was that the dam should not be constructed. Ethiopia went ahead and did and put up the dam. They've even gone ahead and started filling it, all to the concerns of Egypt, and they even have suffered for it because there is some aid that's been withheld for Ethiopia because of that. So this Nile River dispute has become quite important, and in the coverage you will see the U.S. Treasury getting involved. In actual fact, during this time, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was heavily involved in a lot of the conversations. And when you look at that coverage and you reflect upon the fact that it's always seen by analysts that the Trump administration hasn't paid attention to Africa, you actually start revising yourself when you look at what kind of involvement they had in this particular matter. But it was probably a unique one in that they had a vested interest in assisting Egypt, and also that key officials of the Trump government, Mike Pompeo and the Secretary of the Treasury, they were involved a lot in this conversation. The other little aspect that I could point out, and I brought it here just because I needed it to be somewhere, is a question of an African matter about U.S. interests in what goes on in Africa. And it was epitomized by the way the United States opposed the reappointment of the president of the African Development Bank. And this particular one was a serious, attack on Akinwumi Adesina and the opposition, which was sustained and brought in even the World Bank, and all the African countries were supporting him. It's not very clear from reading media reports why the United States opposed this reappointment of the ADB president, and why the United States was so vested in a multilateral financial institution that really just focuses on Africa. There are some threads about why Adesina, became the target of such vitriol. But I think what is interesting is to see the United States in this coverage, the way it pays so much attention to something like this, and then takes a position and really executes it. Adesina got up the appointment anyway, but it wasn't without a lot of attack, and in actual fact, I think it almost went to his individual reputation. In the process, also the bank itself, ADB, suffered the institutional loss of reputation. One other one, which is very also connected, they were at different times, but this is Africa reporting its relations with the United States. These are the attacks on WHO Director General Tedros Ghebreyesus, and Ghebreyesus found himself on being attacked because of his stance, the stance he took during the early days of COVID-19, the stance that the WHO took towards China, and suddenly he was singled out by the Trump administration as a key person who they were claiming was actually working with China, and that didn't go very well. And you here again, you see conversations that actually targeted him with insinuations about his obviously being African, and probably suggesting that there was some connection or some sympathy or an affinity, a propensity to support China rather than do what they should have done. And I mean, everyone knows that the United States then later said they would pull out of the WHO, and I think that Ghebreyesus suffered reputationally, and the coverage by African media captures that. A small item that we saw during this period was that Kenya and the United States had fairly engaging conversations on bilateral trade relations, and that was actually a useful one to see. I'm going to quickly go through the other two slides just to make sure that that you get a sense of what else was going on in the regions of Africa. This is West Africa. Nigeria actually dominates the West African scene, both actually not just the West African scene in News Cycle, but also across Africa. Nigeria generated the highest volumes of coverage during this period from April to September. And the key issues, there were numerous and news frames that were involved. There was an issue about US denying visas, broadly cutting out Africa from through the use of very stringent visa requirements, especially on students And then there were visa denials to Nigerians. There were fraud investigations on a number of fronts, including even past politicians and also connections with money laundering. So a lot of coverage that went into that. Then there are regular news streams, for example, collaborations in the fight against Boko Haram, then the crude oil coverage. The Nigeria and the US had conversations on air transport and signed MOUs on air transport. And unfortunately, this was during the lockdowns due to COVID-19. So it's not very clear where these collaborations on air transport will go. For example, does it mean more direct flights between the two countries? Does it mean other aspects of partnerships? It is yet to be seen. A final issue in Nigeria was as the coronavirus, as coverage intensified and the cases increased in the United States, and many Nigerians thought maybe it was better to be back home, where there were actually very few cases comparatively. And so the media coverage just took on this story about the evacuations and how do you get back home when there was lockdown and there was no air transport available. So really interesting stories about that were seen. You look at the coverage and you realize that much as the United States was already in election mode and a lot of jostling for space, we were going on to the national conventions of both the Democratic Party and the Republicans, but it wasn't what was the focus at the time. The focus was really on some of these issues that I'm mentioning. We see Ghana as well on the graph, and we see Senegal. The issues of the visa rules come in as well. There was, and then there were deportations of Ghanaians from the United States. Those deportations got significant coverage. And then some reports were done on use of child labor on cocoa farms, both in Ghana and in Cote d'Ivoire. And those stories actually were carried. They were denied by both Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, but this report suggested that there was use of child labor, which America would like to oppose. Some good news story also during this period was the use of drone technologies in health and agriculture. In health in Ghana was in deliveries of medical supplies during COVID-19, which was quite innovative. And on the other hand, was in the use of agriculture in doing soil analytics and in advising farmers on the best way to do technology-led or science-led agriculture. A US company called Zipline was involved in those. In Senegal as well, singer Akon was covered extensively because he has this idea, this vision of a futuristic city, and it got a fair amount of coverage from the media across the continent, not just in West Africa. On the Southern African side, coverage, the news cycle during this period from South Africa, which you see getting a fair amount of coverage, the red line. At the beginning was the US giving 1,000 ventilators to South Africa for use in the treatment of patients of COVID-19, and then there was a number of public sector and private sector partnerships that were discussed in the media relating to the fight against COVID-19. The US wasn't amused at all that South Africa, imported or asked Cuba to assist with doctors, and so there were some rumblings about the use of Cuban doctors. And then towards the end, the coverage that you see towards the end of this period is that the US appointed a new ambassador to South Africa, and so that gets some coverage towards the end. Zimbabwe it was in the news right through, and the interesting thing about Zimbabwe is that it was all about tensions, and the first area of tension was the trade embargo against Zimbabwe. It was extended, And then a local businessman with suspected or reported links to the ZANU-PF government had further travel ban and other restrictions on him slapped on him by the U.S. government. The Harare as well summoned the U.S. ambassador to protest George Floyd's death and also to protest injustices against Black people in America. What is interesting is that this story of George Floyd got a bit of coverage, but in the scheme of things, it did not generate that kind of coverage that probably was seen in other areas of the world. In Africa, I think the content was distracted by other things when it came to relations or issues to do with Africa and the United States. We picked up this element of Mozambique. Those of us who have been watching Mozambique know that there is a wave of terrorist attacks linked to Al-Qaeda, and these insurgents these attacks have been intensifying, especially during this period, in fact, under review here. And what is interesting is that the United States doesn't get really involved in the story. There is only sparse mentions of the US and any likely involvement. In actual fact, some of those mentions point to this insurgency as sort of being a regional problem, and the countries in the region being told, you sort it out, and it shouldn't be, the US should not probably get involved. But a number of US envoys warned that, in fact, this what we are seeing is something that is very much that could get out of hand, go into the ways of Boko Haram or go into the ways of Al-Shabaab in Eastern Africa. And they were saying, if you don't deal with it now, it's going to get even worse. And that's the kind of news frame that was associated with Mozambique. The North Africa frames, very interesting frames, were dominated by US-Libya relations, and there was a very aggressive, initiative by the United States to restore some sense of political peace and some normalcy in Libya, where there has been a civil war going on and a declaration of cessation by Eastern Libya. And in the U.S. negotiated agreements that were reported during this period. In fact, the self-appointed prime minister of the Eastern Libya resigned, and there is extensive conversations in the media about the resumption of Libya in export of crude oil, and this was all pointing at Libya being welcomed back into the fold, and so the Trump government was really at the front of trying to resolve this the impasse within Libya, and also to get some broader acceptance of Libya. At the same time, you see other governments like France, Turkey, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates involved in this peace process together with the United States. So extensive coverage. You see the red line representing Libya during the graph, or especially first in the May-June period, and also at the end of this period, about mid-September. Egypt itself was in the news, and I mentioned Egypt earlier. The key issues relating to Egypt was about the impasse over the River Nile and the use of water by Ethiopia, and Egyptian government officials, government ministers, even Al-Sisi, the president himself, were very much involved with officials from the Trump administration in a lot of these things. And you find because the Trump administration was reported to be proposing something which was seen broadly to be in line with what Egypt was seeking. There was a lot of conversations in the media that then would bring together both the US officials and the Egyptian officials. As I said earlier, a lot of those attempts don't seem to have worked. Reports say that Ethiopia went ahead and put up the dam and started filling the dam, much to the dismay of both the United States and Egypt. This is my final slide, and I hope that we can now have a conversation about what really has been going on in African media about US-Africa relations. And we took an extensive amount of coverage, and we did a word cloud analysis. It was so complicated. So we went ahead and simplified it. What you see now is a word cloud that tries to capture two movements at once. One of them is the volumes and intensity of coverage, and that would be represented by the size of the font of the key phrase. And the other one is also the relevance of it for the African media, and it is represented by, maybe it's not very clear when you look at it on the slide, but it is a shift from a red color all the way towards a black. It's like a sort of a rainbow. I don't know whether we succeeded, but I hope you can bear with me. But what you see here is that COVID-19, clearly, when you look at US-Africa relations or US-Africa issues, the news cycle, COVID-19 was the main news frame. But it is interesting. Whenever the US and Africa issues are discussed from a health point of view, often it is the US assisting Africa in research. It is about the US trying to resolve some problem of sickness. You can imagine malaria, HIV and AIDS, Ebola. So there is a very sharp contrast in the coverage of COVID, in the COVID news frame during this period that we are looking at, because the key issues, when you look in, the issues that you see are about US infections and deaths. There's some conversations about gift of some equipment, and also minor research, especially in South Africa. But the broad story is really about almost an African media looking with amusement and in some part bewilderment at what is going on in the United States relating to the spread of COVID-19. There were some stories by some research bodies in the US, a lot of them early in this period, that tried to sort of draw a perspective as to what will happen when COVID-19 properly starts spreading in Africa. And the thought there was that it's going to be, it's going to be huge, it's going to be a pandemic of huge proportions, which obviously hasn't been seen yet. But it also looks like that research hasn't continued. So some of those questions that were, or suppositions that were being produced at the time, haven't continued. When you look around the graph, one of the things that you should look at is, in fact, that the Trump administration has been very proactively engaged in Africa. How do we see that? Look at Mike Pompeo. That's to your left, just above COVID. And look, and you can see that Mike Pompeo is actually a very loud phrase, or a very loud part of the cloud, the way it's been captured. There was a lot of coverage that related to what Pompeo would say, do. He visited Africa, but I mean, he continued, that was in February, but he continued having very direct engagements right across the continent in a number of ways. And so that engagement, in fact, is something that tells you that the Trump administration was very involved. A second tack to this is if you look at Envoy, that's right at the top below trade. Also, by just the font size, it represents just the gravity of the coverage, the volumes of the coverage. And you can see the color is the relevance of the coverage. And that tells you that, when you combine Pompeo, Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, and the ambassadors right across the continent, that is a reflection that there was a lot of proactive engagement from Kenya to Ghana to Namibia, Ghana to Zambia to Zimbabwe. You see envoys being very active at work in those places. The Nile dispute, I've already referred to it. It was actually, I would say, looking at the media coverage alone, the Nile dispute is Trump's most significant diplomacy issue in Africa during the second and third quarters of 2020. There couldn't be another issue that gets the Trump administration so involved. Unfortunately, like I said, their position was that Ethiopia should not have filled the dam, and that the solution lay not in completing the dam, but in other ways. But Ethiopia has gone ahead, and the dam is already being filled, and it's been punished by the Trump administration by withholding $830 million. But the reality is that this issue of the Nile dispute is really a major one during this period as a news subject. The Sudan government, Khartoum, worked very hard during this period to have itself removed from the U.S. list of sponsors of terrorism, and they got significant coverage. It's the one called Terrorism on Your Screen, and this was a single frame that really embraced what actually happened to in the Sudan role, the previous ruler al-Bashir and his ouster, and then it brings the new regime in Khartoum, who are now making overtures towards Washington, and then it puts that together with the litigation that's going on in the United States all the way to the Supreme Court, and the outcomes in May there was a ruling that went against the Sudanese government. But I think there is already it's a fait accompli that in fact Sudan will pay it will pay some compensation and damages, huge amounts, I think going up to about $10 billion to the victims and their families. That's both American victims, Kenyan victims, American families, and Kenyan families, of loved ones, as well as people who were injured. And so there's a lot that was going on there, and that's the one that's referred to as terrorism. When you look at this combined area of trade, Africa Union and AGOA, it's a bit of a disappointment, because I think the promise of the United States being a major player economically to Africa is one that doesn't seem to come out fully. So when you see trade, this is the combined efforts to generate bilateral agreements like the one I mentioned between Kenya and the United States. And Nigeria was having some, if you recall, the one about the air transport, and so was Egypt. But when you look at them, and you take AGOA, which is a major story, you see AGOA even not only by the size of the font, but also by the color fading away from the red. It just tells you that AGOA wasn't a big thing. Think about it. This is one of Africa's guaranteed export opportunities, and it should work very well in Africa's favor. If one says this is the impact of COVID on African exports to the United States, maybe that is a storyline, and maybe the media missed out. What you see happening often is that these other political and security issues seem to dominate media coverage, and this particular one on where there is benefits, direct and immediate benefits for Africa, like in AGOA, don't get the same kind of attention. Okay, so this brings me to discuss one thing that everybody now has on their mind, which is the US elections. And from the word cloud, look below COVID, look below Libya, look below Sudan and Nigeria. In fact, look below Swaziland. Right there, just above China, if you can see it, is the US elections. Small, black, and it tells you for the African media, issues of US elections are in fact not of significance. I'm not talking about whether the implication is of importance. But it looks like African media devoted less and less attention to the US elections compared to, say, the other issues that we've covered. There are several things to talk about here. And the things to talk about here involve, for example, what about coverage of Donald Trump, for example? And Donald Trump got a fair amount of coverage, but that coverage of Donald Trump, not only is it in there, but some of it, you have to remove what is Donald Trump as the US president talking about other things in Africa. And you only isolate where it's about US elections. Because there was so much about Trump, we left it in the US elections. And we thought it was best to bring in the Democratic opposition. I mean, the Democratic Party candidate, that's Joe Biden. And you can see him just above the D in COVID, Joe Biden. You see Biden right there. Same size, same proportion in terms of relevance and volumes to the, to the US elections as a topic, as a phrase in coverage. And I tell you, this is very, very interesting. I think this kind of finding helps us see the extent to which Africa does not think that issues change between elections. And in actual fact, what maybe Africa is doing is to just work with the United States in spite of who is in power, and actually to look at the issues that matter to them today and deal with those. It also may be that the media in Africa wasn't being proactive in generating its own news points or news frames or an agenda for covering US-Africa relations, and that such an agenda was generated externally. Why would I say that? If you look at issues of Khartoum-US relations, issues of the Nile dispute, issues about Libya, they all point to a foreign policy issue driven heavily from the capitals of the world, and especially from Washington. And then it comes and gets, very high play in African media. And if you sit back and say, so what was the role of African media in the coverage? And I think this is something, is a point to ponder, that in actual fact, actually intrinsically generated content for African media doesn't seem to recognize an aspect like US elections and probably its importance for Africa-US relations going forward. It's interesting also to see George Floyd, and you see Floyd right at the top right. I'm not sure how you are receiving that. Top right, just next to AU, and that's Floyd. The Floyd conversations were very obviously limited to the period when George Floyd was arrested and then he died, and then and what happened thereafter, and the protests and the emergence and intensification of protests, Black Lives Matter around the world. That coverage, it drew some protests in some African countries. Those protests were covered. It also drew condemnation by African governments. Those were covered, and I mentioned Harare, for example, even South Africa. But in a sense, it was not. You would wonder, was this an African story, or was this something which was sort of further out? What's the proximity between George Floyd's death and issues of injustice against Black Americans and the African continent? It's an area that needs maybe to be looked at yet again. And this coverage points to the fact that it's something that could actually tell us a lot. There has been some suggestion that, in fact, the discourses between Africans and African Americans should never be seen through the prism of color. But it is something that maybe the people who watch the George Floyd and the fall and the implications of his death may have wanted to say, then maybe the African continent is going to express outrage. And the media coverage and our studies don't quite capture that. got a couple more points to go, and then I can hand over to Brooks. And the one that we cannot forget is visa problems. And you can see visa, the visa itself as a phrase, Word Cloud uses phraseology. So visa itself as a subject in media coverage is there, and it related purely to the curtailment of visas for Africans, especially African students, broadly Africans living in the United States being deported or being threatened with deportations and outright denial of visas. And it is interesting what you see, because in this coverage, you see the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, just below the AU, the big AU phrase, and next, and just above Ghana, you can see DHS. Interestingly, these issues of the visas were far more important to African media than the issues of US elections. That's very clear. And you can see it by just the size of the fonts and the colors which represent the relevance. So you can actually see that African media were very interested in ensuring that the idea that Africans wanting to travel to the US for study, or who are already there, others who had links with the US and couldn't, continue with their links to the US normally because of denial of visas, that this did not continue. So this was useful in getting to see whether there is a sort of a pocketbook or a pocketbook issue for Africans. And I think the pocketbook issue here, visa, does pass the test that it could be a pocketbook. It would be interesting to see why this is the case, and whether there are more and more Africans that want to travel to the United States, or is it historical that there has been always this feeling that the United States, obviously being the ultimate country to destination to either visit or to emigrate to, and whether that the denial of visa seems to be sort of a frustration of the African American, let's call it now, the American African dream. And I think it's something for researchers to go back and look. My final point on this slide, and my final point on my presentation, is one which is the ghost of China that never goes away. And it's interesting because the database that we are looking at, media content database, taps US Africa media coverage. So the question is, why would China be so prominent in US Africa media content? Well, some of it actually, it's got nothing. It's a self-inflicted wound. The United States should have had a field day. Almost an exclusive, opportunity to be covered by African media, because this database actually is biased, because it looks only at where there is US and Africa relations. But when the Trump administration continually looks to try and say Africa's relationship with China is toxic, is soiled, is not good, is not a level playing field, Africa is losing, all these frames, when you keep picking them up, and the one proponent for those frames is Mike Pompeo. So when you pick up all these frames and you look together, over this period of time, China emerges almost like a counterweight in these conversations. And it is very interesting that, every once in a while you go in for a couple of weeks, and Beijing and China trip you on the road to enjoying the US Africa media coverage. And it always comes up. It's that issue, it's all that thing that doesn't, it's that element that doesn't go away. And I think Beijing, China find themselves into the picture of US Africa media or US Africa relations because of what China has become. The dependence on China in so many ways across the African continent. The rising indebtedness of African countries to China, and the role of America in trying to use that element to fight in its in the geopolitical the geopolitical debates between the West and China, where it comes to where should Africa be looking for partnerships and support at this time. I'll leave that point for people who are interested in establishing what more is going on and what more can be done. But for sure, that was something that we picked up. You'll also see, I mentioned general African issues like African leading individuals like the Director General of WHO or the President of the Africa Development Bank, and those are represented by the general phrase Africa on the in the word cloud. Thank you so much, and back to you, Gilbert.
Thank you very much, Nixon. Really comprehensive analysis, media reportage, Africa media reportage of the U.S. And I think there is a lot that we need to probe after Brooks has presented, especially the word cloud, which I find very fascinating, and good topics there that we've been trying to wrestle with since we started this series of the meaning of U.S. elections to Africa. Let's go to Brooks, but before then, I want to suggest to the participants that if you could begin posing your questions in the chat room, please, so that after Brooks finishes, then we can take some of your questions. Brooks, if you could take the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Gilbert. I have 3 parts to a presentation, and I will honestly say to you, one of them was totally unexpected. I did not think I would be speaking, writing, contemplating this one. So let's start with that one. I woke up this morning, the phone was ringing off the hook just before 7 o'clock. I was trying to catch up a little bit on some sleep after having had to write, watch, discuss on all the media possible about the debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And it was a local radio network calling me to let me know that Donald Trump and his wife had tested positive for COVID. And if I could stand by in 2 minutes, I should offer some analysis of this. I'm not entirely sure what I said because I was sound asleep, but I think I managed to get through to the end of this. This is in an electoral cycle in which there have been surprise after surprise, and it becomes, in a grammatical barbarism, more unique every day. This one must be the October surprise to end all October surprises, because it thoroughly upends everything that we were sure we understood about this electoral cycle. Questions about the debate schedule, the process of campaigning, even the ability of a candidate to withstand the rigors of this electoral cycle. And now every one of those is being called to be re-examined. But there are other, sorry, let me shoot my notes. There are other questions that down the road we really need to think about yet further. The overall questions to the election: what happens if Donald Trump is simply too sick to continue campaigning, or even ceases to be available to campaign because he's passed away? Now, chances of that are low, but they're obviously now rather larger than they might have been last week. But there are more immediate governing challenges. Will his illness, if he begins to develop symptoms, lead the cabinet and the vice president to move on the often discussed but very rarely considered 25th Amendment to the Constitution, the disability amendment, in which they declare the president is incapable of discharging his duties, and at least for a period, the responsibilities move to the vice president. Those of you who've seen the film Air Force One can understand the quality of that discussion that might take place. But then there are also international and national security consequences. How are other nations going to respond to the disarray that is already evident among White House staff? What about the continuity and security of military command and control? Is it assured? Does everybody understand exactly how this is going to be? What kind of foreign responses are likely to come if such things become confused or vague or less than coherent? And even, will this affect the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court? She was, after all, at the White House the other day in close proximity to Hope Hicks, who was the first one to have been first one to show a positive response, aid to the president. She was in close proximity to the vice president and to the president. Will she now have to be tested? Probably, and quarantined? Possibly. And if so, does that mean her nomination won't even get considered by the Senate before the election? The problem is, for all of these questions, none of us have any answers. And if you were to turn on your television right now, you would see talking heads chewing this over, muttering sagely about these questions and having no answers. And I assure you, I don't have answers yet either. But I now am obviously tasked with writing about this between now and Sunday evening. So by Sunday evening at 6 o'clock, I fully expect to have answers. Now, the second part of my presentation, I want to talk about the debate and the campaign so far. And I apologize if I look a little tired or if my voice sounds a little weary, because we've already done about 4 or was it 5 interviews on the earlier topic between this morning and right now. Like a lot of people, I watched the debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and I know Gilbert did. He didn't have any choice either. But I watched it twice, so just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And my initial observation was that without question, this was probably the worst demonstration of democratic practice that I've ever seen. And it wasn't just for and with Americans in a domestic setting. The whole world had a chance to watch this, and the whole world had a chance to make some observations and evaluations about what they had seen. If voters and citizens in America and around the world were searching for understanding of this democratic practice in this strange place called the United States, they certainly couldn't find any of that in the debate, although they without question managed to discover the nature and character of the incumbent president, if they were not already clear about it. There was one saving grace in this debate, and I point to it clearly. Climate, environment, and global, and ecology, the environment, and global climate change had a much larger place in it than I would have expected, and certainly would have been the case at any previous debate. Even if we were told that one way to fix this was to get rid of the dead trees. That was Donald Trump's contribution. Joe Biden, on the other hand, all his challenge was to stand there and look responsible and not ramble and not go off onto strange non sequiturs. He simply had to look the part in this audition to those who weren't already familiar with him. The challenge for Donald Trump, of course, was to gather in his base, and further, they're already committed to him come heck or high water, hell or high water, but this was to lock that down and maybe, just maybe, win some converts to his cause, not among Democratic voters and not probably even among the very small number of people who were undecided, but among those people who are eligible to vote, but who heretofore have not chosen to vote, of whom there are many, many millions of people who have sat out previous elections, which is why I like to say that Donald Trump won the presidency with 24% of the eligible vote. And that's basically how it worked out. And Donald Trump simply had to avoid giving vent to his favorite conspiracies and such theories, and not to resort to ad hominem attacks. And unfortunately, he failed to rise to any of those challenges. The great flaw in the debate, of course, was the moderator, Chris Wallace, who had just a few weeks before had given Donald Trump a severe grilling in a one-on-one interview, but this time lost complete control of the process and was never able to gain it back. And this is now provoking a conversation which may already have been overtaken by the COVID exposure in the White House, to how best to restructure the debates, to how best to create a situation where one candidate cannot simply talk over the other one entirely. But prior to this latest revelation, where exactly does the electorate stand? Well, if you look at the polling data, all of the polling data, not just your favorite poll, but if you look at the poll of polls, for example, it appears that Joe Biden has maintained a roughly plus or minus 10% lead nationally among eligible voters. But of course, national polls don't tell us everything we need to know because of the nature of the American electoral system. You don't win on a popular vote. You win state by state by state, and you gain the electoral votes of that state's population relative to the entirety of the country. And so that means with the 538 electoral votes that are available, you have to win 270. That means that certain states matter a great deal more than others. California, New York State, Illinois, reliably Democratic. Texas used to, most recently was considered reliably Republican. But the states that are up for grabs, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida. And as a result, within each of those states, small groups of people, because those states are seen as relatively evenly divided and contested, a small shift in those states swings the vote one way or the other, giving that electoral vote to the candidate that they so choose. And the demographic groups that one therefore has to watch especially carefully are suburban stroke college educated stroke white women who are seen now to be very firmly in Joe Biden's camp, those over 65 who have a tendency to vote more frequently and more consistently, rather, not only vote one vote per person per election, obviously, more consistently than any other group. And they are, by polling now, seem to be swinging toward Joe Biden's camp because fears about healthcare. And Black and brown voters who have heretofore been seen as reliably Democratic and appear not to be changing that style very much. But that gender split is critical because now, if you look at all women versus all men, more women as a percentage are in favor of Joe Biden than more men are in favor of Donald Trump. And so the gender split becomes truly important. The next observation, of course, is that unlike previous elections in recent years, say since about 1952, basically, we won't know more than likely who's won on the evening of November 3rd. It's a great American ritual to sit in front of your television and watch as state by state is declared by the vote counting parts of the media for one candidate or the other. It's much more likely now with the vast number of mail-in ballots and advance voting, which have to be tabulated and counted on the day of the election. It is likely that it is going to be several days at a minimum before we have a final answer. And that means there is the possibility of mischief, presumably on the part of those people supportive of Donald Trump. As for the issues that are driving this campaign, if you watch the survey data, clearly the issues that are most important are the way in which the government is or is not handling the pandemic. As a result, the way in which the government is or is not reigniting the economy, the question of quote unquote law and order versus, and I use the term versus in a sort of very tentative and hesitant kind of way. So law and order versus the current racial tumult and demands for redress along racial lines as one issue area. Healthcare, which has become extremely important for people as they contemplate, for example, the cost and the effect of the pandemic, and the environmental and climate change issue, which is in fact rising. And that is a function of the fires on the West Coast, which have been extraordinary and captured public attention and concern. The overall presidential chaos, that is, you wake up every morning afraid to look at your newspaper. And the most recent entry just earlier in the week, Donald Trump's tax issues. Most people pay more in taxes than Donald Trump has in some years, including the fact that in some years he's paid none at all. But if you read the New York Times expose or stories that relate to it, when the man has paid $750 a year on his federal income tax for several years, that works out to much less than the average waitress who works largely for tips might be paying. That's quite extraordinary, and that's become an issue for some people. But of course, turnout is the great imponderable. And turnout has always been in recent years around 60%. But it is possible with the mail-in advance voting, this may increase significantly. And if you read the data, that's my wife going to check the windows and the doors and make sure everything doesn't flood us all of a sudden, as it just started to rain in our neck of the woods. Turnout is that great imponderable. If over 1 million people have already voted by advance balloting or mail-in ballots, it is likely that that 60% or so turnout number may well grow significantly. The estimates are there may well be 80 million of those advance or mail-in ballots. And since no one knows for sure, it's going to be quite something. I'm going to move closer to my microphone so that you can still hear. Of course, it isn't just Donald Trump or Joe Biden that's going to be decided. It's 35 out of 100 senators, including 2/3 of those up this time around are Republican, the entire House of Representatives, and literally thousands of other offices. So the way in which the issues play out for Donald Trump or Joe Biden matter for many, many other office bearers across the country. And now I want to go quickly to part 3 of my discussion, and that's the question of media. And Nixon has covered in great depth and I think interesting detail the issue of how the US is covered variously in African nations. I want to talk a little bit about the type of media we're talking about now. If you look at the United States, it is important to realize that the single most important source for information, news type information, as opposed to, I don't know, sports or beauty care or personal relations or things like that, remains television as it has been for many years. But there appears to be a break point. Those people who are 50 and above, television remains the key for them. Below them, it is changing. It is becoming increasingly social media and online news. If you look at that data a little further, and I'm looking at studies that were done by the Pew Research Center, for example, they cover things like this. If you look at where coverage is emanating from, putting aside television now, radio, online news sites, and social media are now ahead of print newspapers generally for the United States. And that's interesting because that means that although we tend to think about coverage in newspaper terms, it is no longer true that most people are getting their news from that. If you're watching television, it is not the national news you are most interested in. You are, in fact, most interested in your local news, because unlike many countries in the world, there are a large number of individual stations that are not part of a network all over the United States, or even network stations have special local and even regional coverage that they follow. And I want to quote just a chapter, not a chapter, I beg your pardon, a paragraph from the Pew Center. It says, social media sites have surpassed print newspapers as a news source for Americans. 1 in 5 US adults say they often get news via social media, slightly higher than the share who often do so from print newspapers, for the first time since Pew Research Center began asking these questions, and this was at the end of 2018. In 2017, the portion who got news via social media was about equal to the portion who got their news from print newspapers. Now, social media's small edge over print emerged after years of steady declines in newspaper circulation and modest increases in the portion of Americans who use social media. Now, I understand in Africa, in my time in various countries in this continent, that and I've always acted in my work, that radio was and still is the primary medium for news delivery and consumption across the continent. But I'm beginning to believe that as the internet and internet access increases its penetration in many parts of the continent, social media and online news must clearly be gaining. And I think it is probably appropriate to look carefully at multi-platform outlets where they are putting their news and who is watching or listening or reading. But in my own experience working in South Africa, Namibia, Swaziland, and Nigeria, if that's any guide, most news reporting in Africa, on the continent, as it pertains to the United States itself, rather than the specific issues that Nixon was talking about that are covered, country-specific issues, for example. I must say that coverage of the United States tends to be spotty. It follows the breaking news style of coverage, and it's heavily reliant on international wire service copy and occasionally local experts for short commentaries, but almost never on US-based Africa media reporters, unless logically it's about a breaking bilateral or regional question. I'm not aware of, at this moment, except for South Africa, if there are in fact any African associated correspondents based primarily in the United States at this point. And if there aren't, then the question of why not is important. And I think the largest question probably is the cost. Cost of maintaining a correspondent in the United States is very high. And I'm not entirely sure that media in Africa generally have the ability to do that unless they are drawing on freelancers or others who can commit a certain small portion of their time to a particular African media house. For me, one key question is how the reporting of the United States affects African or foreign perceptions of the US, its government, and most especially its president. And I think all the surveys that I've read over the last 5 years or so all point to the fact that respect for and admiration of America has been on a steadily declining curve through the entirety of the Trump administration. And the open question for me is whether or not that is a reversible trend or whether that is in fact a trend that is going to continue or at the minimum remain at the kind of level that it is now. And that ties, I think, a little bit to what Nixon was saying right at the end of his presentation. There is, I suspect, a growing admiration and respect and understanding or appreciation of China in the international context. And so the next moments, the next weeks, days, months, years, are going to be how the two countries, the US, China, are viewed by Africans. If the United States survives this year's election, and if it somehow figures out how to deal with the COVID crisis, fixes its economy, begins to reverse the chaos of the Trump era, it is possible there will be a recovery. But if I had to bet on it, I'm not sure I would take that side of the bet just yet. With that, Gilbert, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Brooks, for that comprehensive coverage of the three big issues that you outlined. I thought I would start by just posing a few questions to you. First to Nixon, if you can respond to Brooks' critique around the print media, that it's less salient in our understanding of how the US is treated in Africa. I just thought it's an interesting dimension. If social media is going to overtake print media, how is that going to affect your research on perceptions of the US? I thought we would start there. And then my other question would be, something that I've had, I've always thought about, that the US elections actually don't really matter to African audiences. And I thought maybe you could just reflect on that a little bit. You gave some good explanations as to why you thought that is the case. But I thought it's an important point to really put across. Brooks, if I could ask you after Nixon has answered, if you could talk about the October surprises. I think you called this the mother of October surprises, but I just thought you would walk us through some of the more historical ones that you remember, so that the audience at least is beginning to get a sense of what the October surprises mean in the US electoral process. Nixon?
Thank you, Gilbert. The question of, what is going on between different types of media around the world, and what is being seen almost as the inevitable, that print media is going to be permanently changed. And probably some people, some people have said that this could actually be the print media is, we are seeing it's in its last throes. Across Africa, what we know is that media in Africa is young. It sort of fits within the period of independence to now. So mostly between up to about 50 to 60 years old. In many other countries, the media is a product of the second wave of democracy, which makes it about 20 to 30 years old. And so print media, when you talk about print media, then you have to also look at it in terms of whether it is a small media that only maybe circulates in some particular areas, or like in urban areas, or is it widespread? And these are long standing conversations and debates on students of African media issues. There are questions about whether also the emergence of new media, not necessarily social media, but online media, media based on internet-based media, what that means for where we are going forward. So two things. One is that there aren't that many titles, print media titles in Africa as there could be in Europe or North America. That's one. The second problem is that those titles don't circulate. The circulation per capita or across the population is low. And that's because the reading cultures are much lower in Africa than anywhere else in the world. But I mean, also, that news reading is also become reading has become itself a generational issue, not just in Africa, but across in Europe and other places. So studies done in the US, in the UK, in Sweden, and in parts of the US are showing that the older generations, their reading patterns are, they show a stark contrast when you look at what the millennials and the generation and the younger folk are doing in terms of their reading cultures, and also news consumption itself. So in Africa, I think the one unique number is that most print have online presence. A lot of new online based media has emerged. Why would it emerge in Africa? It's cheaper, and it would get them much wider circulation, and it is harder to control. A lot of print media outlets during the days of African autocrats suffered immensely because despotic governments could come in and shut down your operation. They could go and shut down your printing. They could impound copies on the streets. They had so much rope as to what they could do with you. Well, hello. These are the days when you put a story online and there is nothing you can do about it. We saw at the rise of the Arab Spring that Egypt tried to control, like shut down internet. Ethiopia tried to do the same, shutting down internet. But I think there has been a lot of studies that are showing that such successes are, there is no guarantee because there are so many other ways to circumvent the formal links that people have to the internet. So in a sense, when you look at it on a normal day, the online platforms are proving to be very useful. Old media, as radio, television, and newspapers have online presence. Then you include new upcoming media. And I think that is what we are looking at when you say, where is African media? Is that it's in this mix that is very dynamic, that is renewing itself fairly rapidly, and that remains that it is reaching all the places it wants to reach. The combination of social media and these other forms of traditional media is growing very rapidly. And so something will happen on Twitter or on Instagram, and it will immediately be seen in traditional media. Examples here are, for example, the breaking stories in South Africa about arrests of significant politicians and other individuals in the current crackdown on corruption. And those stories are breaking on radio, they're breaking on social media, and they're breaking online almost simultaneously. And radio has this advantage of being instantaneous. But because online can break news also quite quickly, we are seeing that it's almost not guaranteed that it's radio that's going to get to the touchline faster. In Kenya, for example, there was a terrorist attack on the Dusit B hotel, and that attack was covered faster on online media combined with social media well before television, which was doing live coverage, got in. And by the time television live images went around the world, a lot of the content, including use of YouTube and Facebook, had already gone through. People were live streaming on Instagram, whatever was going on. Okay, you are not going to call that journalism, but you're just going to call that just information dissemination. And so I hope that explains the fact that looking forward at where is African media, these new forms are going to need to be taken much more seriously. Their organization is not being well studied because so many things are happening. But I think that when you look at their structure and conduct, there is hope that is the area to be. Your second question, Whoop, I wish I knew the answer. Do American elections matter? Let's first ask to Africa. They do. They do, because a change in government will mean a change in policy. It means almost sometimes a turnabout in what kind of priority areas governments were working in. What we have seen, though, is that because there isn't that much change almost simultaneously in the other arms of government, especially the legislature, in Congress, both the Senate and the House, that there is much more continuity thanks to that lack of not everything is swept out when a president leaves power. And then the second thing is that when a president wins a re-election, then there is a continuation of policies from the previous from your previous first term. Obviously, you do not do a third term; you only do 2 terms. So within 8 years, then there has to be the question of whether there is going to be continuation or not. But there has been some elements that are very promising about the relations between Africa and the United States to almost mean that much as there could be a shift in policy, some policies have become standard. Take, for example, AGOA. AGOA was introduced by President George Bush, and President Obama allowed it to continue. In fact, started conversations to extend it. And President Trump has not changed that policy. What he has done, though, is that the implementation has sometimes been punitive on African countries where, and I don't want to say President Trump wants particular things, but where his administration thinks that there could be benefit for America. I mean, it's not easy to say that there is something so substantive to pick in Africa, but they pick up fights with Rwanda over used clothes because Rwanda wants to grow its own textile industry, and America wants to offload used clothing that should come into the market and be sold in the streets of Rwanda. And in the process, America denies Rwanda the opportunity to enjoy the full benefits of AGOA. What do we make of that? I think I see an overreach by the Trump administration in some elements, but I also see that broadly some policies have been maintained. There is a sense actually that has been carried for a long time that in fact African governments, so long as African governments suffer losses, so long as African governments aspire for democracy, so long as wherever there is an abuse of democracy, that there is outcry, then the United States will come to help Africa. And we've seen that over and over again as a general rule. So you'll see the United States interfere, or not interfere, but interject to help prop democratic processes, like where there is abuse of rule of law. You'll see where there is embrace of democracy. You'll see the United States coming in to partner. And the NGO community that's now called the second government in Africa has benefited immensely from relations with a variety of organizations that are linked to the US government. For example, the USAID has worked very well with a broad range of NGOs across Africa. Your mic, please.
Thank you again for that response. Could we go to Brooks?
Gilbert, if you don't mind, I'm going to address both your question and one element of one of the questions that you posed to my co-panelist. Let me do that one first because that will take less time. I'm always amazed at how little interest people and media generally in Africa take on the economic aspects of US-Africa relations, not necessarily individual country, bilateral questions, but the larger picture. And I think the example that Nixon posed, AGOA and Rwanda and the used clothing imbroglio, is important because it's crucial to realize that it wasn't just American interests versus Rwandan interests. Rwanda wasn't a unified set of interests. There were, in fact, Rwandan government officials and some business people who wanted to spend much more time and energy and create a textile and clothing industry. But a lot of the vendors of used clothing in Rwanda were a significant portion of the economy as well. The importers of these large bales of pre-sorted and cleaned used clothing, and then the resellers of it. So it was not simply a bilateral struggle, although it sometimes was portrayed that way. It was often a much more complex kind of question that impinged on Rwandan domestic issues, because the amount of influence and interest exporters from the United States of used clothing bundles have is minimal. The reverse is not true in Rwanda. The importers of it and the resellers and then the resellers of it, they represented a fairly substantial collection of interests and individuals and the economy itself. But one of the things that means is that there has not been, for the most part, and there are exceptions. I mean, South African journalists to some degree do a very good job on that, is to pick apart the economic issue in terms of competing interest in governments and within governments and the domestic repercussions of it within respective countries. But too often I find these things are phrased as sort of like country A versus country B, and that's the issue. And sometimes it isn't the issue. AGOA itself it's not a treaty, and people tend to misunderstand that. It's a unilateral act by the United States that has a limited time applicability. And the fact that it will run out now in 4 years and some months means that Africans who want greater access to the American market for products at a duty-free or a tariff-free level need to begin to figure out how they're going to negotiate for duty-free access, either as a regional bloc or as a continental bloc. And I see absolutely no evidence of any of that being done. The reason why it's important to think about it now is somebody did a study, I can't remember who it was, but the average time it took to negotiate a free trade agreement between the United States and country or group X was somewhere between 5 and 7 years, which means that AGOA will die and disappear well before any sort of agreement would be negotiated and signed upon if everything went well. And the last time Southern Africa tried this, it didn't work because the countries in Southern Africa didn't actually have a common set of interest on how that was going to proceed. And a couple of countries even said they simply don't have enough people in their bureaucracy to staff it out properly, which was, I think, sort of a strange response, but not for me to say. With regard to your question, we throw around the phrase October surprise sort of easily, and it's not, it probably should get more explanation than I gave it. It simply means that think in terms of the electoral cycle. The election comes on the first Tuesday of November. And by early October, well, let me back up a bit. Usually in an American election, it isn't until Labor Day, that is the first Monday in September, people are back from vacation, children are going back to school, all kinds of things happen so that you're no longer thinking about whether it's the mountains, the beach, or a summer job. And as a result, your attitudes and your ideas and your views about candidates begin to harden. And whatever you do as a candidate between September 3rd, 4th, or 5th and the first week of November has been pretty well set into emotional or attitudinal concrete by then. And an October surprise is something that seems to come clear out of the blue, that usually a sitting president and her staff finds a way of announcing that this is what will happen, or this is about to happen, or that is such an earth-shaking within the context of that debate about the candidate, between the candidates. It changes the basic texture of the landscape. Now, we've already had this year 6 different September and October surprises the most recent of which was this morning on October 2nd. But you asked historically, and the two that come to mind first, in 1968, when Richard Nixon was running for president against Hubert Humphrey, who ultimately had become the candidate after a whole series of assassinations and other things, Richard Nixon's operatives, and it wasn't entirely clear to people until afterward, they had quietly passed the message to the South Vietnamese government that if you just maintain a hard posture against the possibility of negotiating with the North Vietnamese in Paris, then we will back you for a tougher settlement once we come into office. And as a result, the South Vietnamese developed a particularly public, obdurate attitude toward further negotiations. And it became clear that Richard Nixon had, in the views of enough people, the ability or the willingness to back the South Vietnamese, even if he had what he called his secret plan for peace. Although that phrase actually was used a little later. But then in 1972, I'm trying to remember how many weeks before the election, just a few, Henry Kissinger, who by then was operating as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, came back from negotiations in Paris and announced to the press, peace is at hand. Nice, and it was banner headlines everywhere. Peace is at hand. And that helped to secure his election, even if it was not true that A, peace was at hand, or that B, there was a settlement that was acceptable to all the parties involved in that particular negotiation. In fact, there was no peace at hand, and the war would rumble on for another 3 years, 2.5. And so the term, the October surprise, now has developed something of a life of its own. It's the thing that upsets everything we know about the electoral landscape in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, and presumably to the advantage of the person for whom this surprise has been announced or launched. Does that help, Gilbert? Was that?
Yeah, thank you. That's actually because I just wanted some historical perspective. So that,
Sorry?
I wanted some historical perspective, which you have provided. Yeah, so you provided the history that I wanted, really. And thank you very much. Do we have any questions from the audience? The audience looks very quiet tonight. I think maybe it's a Friday evening or Friday morning. Let me see, there's yeah. I don't think we have any questions from the chat. I think the discussion has been very rich and very informative. And I think I want to take this opportunity just to ask our two presenters to make their final remarks, and then we can close it after those presentations, after those final remarks. If I can start with Brooks.
Final remarks, final observations. 2-3 weeks ago, I would have thought that pretty much everything that would have been, if not cast in iron in the election, at least had begun to gel, so that the predictability of what was going to happen was finally upon us. And of course, we have been rudely disabused of that notion repeatedly now. And what it does mean is that we all have to watch more carefully. We all have to watch with much more interest or fear or trepidation or something, but we can't take for granted anymore all the preconceptions we brought to this particular American electoral cycle. That's one observation. And the second observation really is that those of us who pay attention to this have really got to spend more time watching, studying, reading, listening, perusing a much different media landscape than might have been the case a decade ago. I mean, a decade ago, there was no social media effectively. Now it's an important part of anybody with an electronic device. And if you're a candidate, if you're not on social media of one type or another, desperately trying to break into the news cycle, you are effectively nowhere. And I don't know whether that's good or bad, but that certainly is the nature of the landscape now. And it's beginning, as Nixon says, to permeate the African landscape as well. My third observation, though, is something that goes back to what I said earlier, which is that the coverage of the United States by African media generally is too dependent on the fairly anodyne wire service copy or reports that are made available, whether it's AFP or the AP or some other wire service. It doesn't matter. There is very little in the way of independent analysis and effect. And it's not because there are no Africans in America or people of African background in America who have a clear sense of African attitudes and ideas. I'm just not sure that media have spent enough time trying to tap into that network of people. And that would be, if there's a niche, if there's an entrepreneur out there in the media business, that would seem to me to be a pretty good niche market to start looking at more carefully. Because there must be people, there must be a willingness, and there certainly is an interest, even if it's not about the latest music star. Mm-hmm. And one last sort of tie-off comment to that. BBC, VOA, and various other broadcast media put a considerable amount of time and energy into broadcasting into Africa using African journalists in many ways and many cases. And the range of programs is actually quite interesting and quite good. I don't listen to it as much as I used to. I probably should listen to it more. But the studies that I have seen say a very large number of people on the continent do listen to it and read, perhaps if they have access, read the written versions of the reports that come from it. So there seems very clearly to be a market for that kind of material. And I would encourage somebody to consider it. And that, I think,
thank you, Brooks.
Thank you to both of you.
Thank you very much. Nixon?
Yeah, yes, and it's great. Some of the issues raised by Brooks, I agree with him, especially the one he says that there are gaps in how the African media cover the US. Those gaps, I think, could well be covered if areas, for example, how could Africa benefit from closer trade and economic relationships with the United States? Those are the kind of ways that that one can see. And I walk to to the consulate or the embassy or to speak to the trade attaché or some other officials, and you start there and then you back up that with some bit of research, and then the story is really not in the US, the story is right at home, is what can be done. And when you look, part of it comes back to, do we have quality that matches what the United States needs as a market? Do we have the volumes? And there are some stories about the failure of success. Like one time, the breweries in East Africa, they have a popular drink there, and they decided they were going to take it to the United States, and they did. But when it got there, and it was something like 3 or 4 containers, it was done by the end of the week. And the estimate was something like, if you really want to come in and sort of be felt, you need like 3 or 4 times the kind of breweries installation you now have in Kenya. And suddenly you can see the opportunity of the market is there, but you have the capacity to produce for that market. The media, they have a role to play in getting, how do you start up and get to that size, because you don't do it overnight. And I think those ideas are not well covered. They don't have a space. And I think especially this area of trade and the economy is one that there could be a lot. Let's bring it home and say, what could happen? I mean, I'm looking at what happened today. This preparation for me was very historical, and maybe for some people it's boring, given the bombshell that the October surprise that Brooks talks about for this morning. I'm looking at what is going to happen if one was to say, how is the African media going to react to this morning's news and to whatever is going to happen? I think the first thing the media is, there is amusement, sort of an amusement to that the things that happen in Africa have happened in the United States in the recent past. It all began when Katrina went and brought down New Orleans, and a side of suffering and despondency in the United States was revealed. And Time magazine said it looked like a third world. And I think there has always been a feeling like Africa is so far back, and the problems we have are so intractable that we maybe cannot get out of them, or they are only about us. But now you look at some of that, the suffering in the United States, some of the injustice that has been highlighted in the media globally from the United States, the tests that the US democracy project has been subjected to in the past 10 years, in actual fact, in the past 20 years, because there was a lot that was invested in the Democratic president of Barack Obama. A lot has gone in, and those tests are wonderful for Africa to see. Is the African media picking up those lessons and not getting sort of attracted to the trivia? For example, to look at some of the things that sometimes they get trapped with, or the bling of Hollywood, or the idea of fanatism about particular music stars. So I think there needs to be some bit of a sober minds, especially among the African media, and to start looking at what do we pick up from these things. The US democracy project will survive. It has survived for a very long time, and it will survive. And I think the lesson for us is to see, and especially for the African media, is how could they learn where their own projects, given that many of them are still at a very early age, only a few decades old, some of them even under 20 years old. How well can we learn from some of the ways that the US democracy project asserts itself, endures challenges, and forges on with strength to that next day. And I think those are the kind of things I'm hoping that African media could learn and could be picking up and bring forward as lessons for us from the US, especially this time with the US presidential and other national elections.
Thank you very much, Nixon, for those words of wisdom. And I thank both of you for your generosity, your time, and your very penetrating analysis. I think we ended on a very strong note. Where is the African media in this, and what needs to be done? I think it's a good issue to revisit. And I like Brooks' point about, the media, if it's not focusing on bread and butter issues like economic engagement with the US, what is it actually doing? And we have to be, I think we keep coming back to that issue. And it's an interesting point to make, because we need to get a sense of where our media is. Is it out there, or is it sleeping? This has been a very good discussion, and I thank the two of you. I also want to thank the audience for being very patient with us and coming today and listening in. I also want to invite you, next week we'll have a session on geopolitics and the US election, so we can get in voices around China. What does China think of the US election, but from African perspective? So I want to thank you and wish you a very happy weekend. And then hopefully I can see you next week again on this very forum on US elections and Africa. Thank you again, and good night.